Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today we're taking a look at the Sennheiser IE600s. These have been a long time coming, so thank you to your patience for all of those who've been asking for this one. It did take me a while to arrange a pair of these, but we're here now. And I should also mention before we get underway that I got the pricing of the IE600s wrong in the recent Thieaudio Monarch Mark II video. In that video where I compared the Monarch Mark II to the IE600, I think I might have grabbed the Australian dollar price and set it as the US dollar price. So apologies for that. The IE600s, as I have them here, are actually a $700 US IEM, not a $900 US IEM as I might have said in the Monarch Mark II video. And so with that in mind, the IE600s sit very nicely in that kind of mid-tier realm. As I've already mentioned, I've previously compared them to the Monarch Mark IIs, so I'm not going to do that again here in this video, but do go check that one out if you're interested in what you can get for a bit more money and if it's worth it. Because in this review, what I'm going to focus on is the IE600s versus a direct price competitor in the FiiO FH9, and then also comparing them to Sennheiser's own IE900 as a flagship versus mid-tier option within the Sennheiser range. As always though, before we get to sound comparisons and even sound quality, let's talk a bit about the design and the features and benefits of the IE600. As is Sennheiser's way with their IEMs, the IE600 is a single dynamic driver design. They've used a fairly compact 7mm driver inside the shell, and it has an 18 ohm impedance, but no published sensitivity that I saw. Having said that, it's not really relevant. When it comes to sensitivity for IEMs, you generally don't have to worry about it. Unless you've got a particularly hiss-prone source, which these aren't going to be a problem with. Almost all IEMs that are on the market are very easy to drive from anything, be it a phone, a dongle, a full desktop system. You're generally pretty safe. A couple of other things worth talking about when we talk about the design of the IE600 is that these shells are actually a 3D printed metal. It's what Sennheiser call amorphous metal. It's apparently a very high-tech material used by NASA and other sorts of places where there's a lot of need for precision engineering, but the strength of metal. And so these housings are a 3D printed metal. What that allows Sennheiser to do is get a very compact, very precise housing size, and also build in things like a couple of Helmholtz resonators. Now hopefully I'm saying that correctly, it's off the top of my head, but what those resonators are, and there's 3 of them in the IE900 versus 2 of them here, what those are is there's little cavities built in to close to the nozzle of the IE600 that are particularly designed to absorb certain frequencies, and that helps to control unwanted treble spikes, resonances within the cavity within the housing of the actual IEM, and it theoretically should improve the overall refinement of the sound. Certainly in the IE900, the quality of the sound is fantastic, so I was expecting nothing less than that from the IE600, but it was interesting that they'd chosen to use just 2 here instead of the 3 in the IE900. I don't know if that's to do with the cost, I don't know if that's to do with the actual driver and the tuning, I'm not sure, but there's 2 here and there's 3 there. As I've already mentioned, these housings are really nice and compact, and that makes the current range of Sennheiser IEMs some of the most comfortable IEMs I've ever worn. They do fall just short of IEMs like AudioFly and Shure, because they do have a slightly wider nozzle, and for me the very narrow nozzle on the Shure and the AudioFly does make them just a tiny bit more comfortable, but it's a pretty close call. And therefore for most people, these are going to be exceptionally comfortable. The IE600 comes with a couple of cables, and I find them to be a nice quality cable. It comes with a 4.4mm terminated one, which I've got here, and also a 3.5mm terminated one. So unlike the IE900, which when I got it at least had also a 2.5mm, you only get the 2 cables in the IE600 case, but in my experience 2.5mm connections are becoming less and less common. And so I think the fact that it's only 3.5 and 4.4 is completely fine. It is worth mentioning with these cables that unfortunately Sennheiser are using a slightly modified MMCX connector. So where it actually connects here to the IEM, there's a very slight recess at the top of the IEM, and that means you can't use a lot of aftermarket cables unless they're specifically designed for the IE series, that being the IE600 and the IE900. The IE100 is different again, and I haven't seen the IE300. So it is a shame that these aren't a standard MMCX, but hopefully with the popularity of the Sennheiser IEMs, we'll see more aftermarket cables with the specific Sennheiser connectors. The one other thing I should mention about what's included in the package with the IE600, in fact 2 things. One thing is the case, which is not particularly special. I'm not going to go into depth about it. It's just a zip-up semi-hard case. But the other thing you get is a set of tips. You get 3 different silicone sizes and 3 different foam sizes. And I do quite like the tips overall. Having said that, I probably prefer some aftermarket tips. I find sometimes the silicone on the Sennheiser tips is just a little bit too soft. And what I think is happening is as I put it in my ear canal, depending on the exact angle that I put it in, I think it's so soft that it kind of kinks a little bit and it doesn't completely seal. And so I'm finding things like the FiiO E-tips, SpinFit tips, anything like that I tend to prefer slightly because they're just a little bit firmer in the silicone. Having said that, a benefit of using the Sennheiser tips is that there's actually a couple of notches inside the stem being the hole through the middle of the tip. And what those little notches allow you to do is that technically you can insert the tip onto the nozzle, and I don't know if you can see it here, but I'll show some B-roll. You can actually insert the nozzle only slightly into the tip, or you can push the tip all the way onto the nozzle, and it actually locks in 2 places. Now the theory is that you can tune the sound slightly using those 2 different positionings of the tip, but in practice what I've generally found is that as I insert the IEM into my ear, it's unlikely that the tip's going to hold that extended position and normally gets pushed down the nozzle anyway. So it is a nice idea. I don't know if it's entirely practical, but if you've got yourself a pair of IE600s or 900s, and possibly 300s or 100s, I haven't tried it on those, but if you've got yourself a pair of these, check it out. See if you can use the different nozzle positions to get a different sound from your IEMs and find out what you like. If you have tried that, let us know in the comments down below which one you preferred. And so let's now put aside the accessories, the comfort, all that sort of stuff, and get to what probably matters most to you, and that's the sound quality. The very first thing that I noticed when I listened to the IE600s was that they create this little sonic world inside your head. And it's engaging, it's immersive, and it's completely enjoyable. The tonal balance across the board through bass, mids, and treble is fantastic. And I don't mean tonal balance in suggesting that it's completely neutral. My point is more that everything sits well with everything else. So the bass, the mids, and the treble, nothing feels over-enhanced, nothing feels pushed forward or in front of anything else. It's all really nicely shared across the whole frequency range. The detail and separation of sounds is also fantastic. So it creates a really nice sonic image, and you're able to very clearly hear all the individual sounds within the total soundstage. That soundstage isn't particularly large. As I said, it kind of creates a world inside your head rather than throwing it wider or larger in any way. But what's great is that because of that excellent separation and image focus, you don't ever feel like it's congested or lacking in size or space. Coming back round for a moment to that tonality I mentioned before, and it is very balanced between the bass, the mids, and the treble, but it's also a rich and engaging sound. It's not thick, it's not overly warm, but it's also not what I would call really neutral. It's got a sense of colour, it's got a sense of life to it, but it's beautifully, beautifully done, and it's very engaging to listen to. The bass is solid and present when you need it. The mids are wonderfully full and rich, but there's still a good sense of texture because the treble extension goes all the way up with plenty of detail and plenty of energy. And so all in all, the IE600 in isolation is an absolutely marvellous listen. It's an IEM that if you only ever heard this, you'd probably wonder if there was anything to be gained by spending more money. And that is still an interesting question, as we'll talk about in a minute. But before we talk about spending more money, let's start by talking about spending about the same amount of money and see how the IE600 stacks up against another IEM that I think is fantastic in the FiiO FH9. The FiiO FH9 is an IEM that you could probably argue is a better accessorized IEM. It looks a bit more special and feels a bit more special in some ways than the IE600. You could definitely argue that the cable feels nicer. Whether it's actually better quality is probably impossible to say, but it certainly looks and feels a bit more special. I think the shells look and feel a bit more special. The case I think is a little bit nicer. But where things go back in the IE600's favour is that the shells are tiny and therefore I find them a little bit more comfortable. Not by a large margin because the actual nozzles themselves are basically the same size. But if I hold them up next to each other, You can pretty clearly see here that the IE600, if I just get it into focus, the IE600 over here is this teeny tiny shell, whereas the FH9 is quite bulky for an IEM. And so what that can mean is that for some people, the IE600 is going to be vastly more comfortable. For others, it might be neither here nor there. And so let's talk about the sound quality of them. And it's a little bit tricky here because there's 3 different tuning nozzles for the FH9. Check out my separate review of them if you want to understand more about that. But because there's multiple tuning nozzles and even different tips for these, I've used it set up in such a way where I've tried the same tips on both IEMs, which I think from memory I used the final E-type tips for both, and also I've used the bass nozzles on the FH9s because that's my personal preference. And so what I was looking to do was give the FH9s their maximum chance to perform in a way that I enjoy and put them up against the IE600s to see how they compare. One of the tracks I used for this test was Mercy by Duffy, and the first and most obvious difference I heard going between the IE600 and the FH9 was that the FH9 comes across a bit drier and a bit more textural in those upper mids and lower treble. And that also means that the FH9s come across a bit more forward in the upper mids as well. They push forward that sort of presence region of the vocals, which can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your tastes. The FH9, even with the bass tips, doesn't have the fullness of bass that the IE600 does. And that's not to say that the IE600 is some kind of crazy bass monster, so much as that the FH9 is actually not particularly strong in its bass, even though it's a hybrid model using a dynamic driver for the bass and then balanced armatures for the treble and mids. It's a relatively bass-tame IEM, the FH9, and for me the IE600 does have better sense of presence and punch in the bass area. The IE600 to me also separates the sounds better, so you can more easily and clearly hear each individual sound within the soundstage. Not that the FH9 is bad, but for me the IE600 at the price is really exceptional in that area. Something else that I found, and it's hard to kind of narrow this down to one particular feature of the earphone, but something else that I found on this track being Mercy by Duffy, was that when you've got the drums in the left and the right channel at the beginning of the track, the IE600 came across more tactile. I could feel those drums as much as I could hear them. Whereas from the FH9, it was very much just an auditory experience without that tactility, without that sense of feeling the sound wave and the pressure wave hit my ear. Ultimately, I think both earphones are very strong, but for me, the thing that drew me over to the IE600 as a slight preference is the fact that I do think it has that better sense of bass presence, but still keeps it wonderfully controlled, so there's no sense of boom or bloat or overdoing the bass. And for me, I think the IE600 just gets the vocals a little bit more natural. The FH9, as I said before, pushes the upper mids just a little bit too far forward for me, and it can make things just a little bit unnatural and remind me that I'm listening to a recording through a pair of earphones rather than just being immersed in the music. And so for me, whilst I do think the FH9 is fantastic, and if you've seen my recent roundup or kind of comparison video of the FH9, the Meza Advar, and the Hyphaman RE800, you'd know that the FH9 was already one of my top recommendations in this price category. But for me, the IE600 pips it. So for me, the IE600 is clearly, in my opinion, based on what I've heard so far, one of the best options in that $700 price range. But what if you wanted to spend a bit more money? As I said before, for those that have already heard the IE600s, it's completely reasonable to wonder if there's better to be had by spending more money. Part of my answer to that question can be found in the video of the Thieaudio Monarch Mark II that I released recently, where I compared the two. And in case you don't want to go and watch the whole comparison, the recap of that is that I think both are fantastic. But for me, the IE600 was actually, in my opinion, a bit more natural, a bit more engaging sounding. There are certainly strengths of the Monarch Mark II, and if you want to know more about them, go check out that video. But for me, the IE600 proved that it can punch above its $700 price point. And so that brought me around to comparing it directly with the IE900. I've had viewers here on the channel comment that the IE600 is the better IEM, and so I was interested to find out for myself. One of my test tracks for this was Cry Me a River by Ella Fitzgerald, but I should make it clear that I used lots and lots of test tracks for this one because it wasn't a clear-cut decision. Starting off with the IE600 on Cry Me a River, it sounds pretty perfect. It's hard to imagine there being better quality sound than what I was hearing. And by the way, I was listening to this via the Chord Hugo TT2, but I've also tried both IEMs across a whole range of devices, and indeed all of these IEMs I've tried across multiple devices. The sound from the IE600s is smooth, it's detailed, it's balanced across all the frequencies, everything's just great, it's enjoyable, it's immersive, but it's also technically solid too. Moving over to the IE900, and it opens things up more. There's a larger sense of space in the soundstage, the image is a bit more sharply focused from the IE900s, And they managed to produce more detail without emphasizing details, if that makes sense. So it's probably more that there's more details available rather than more details pushed at you. And so as I listened to these and I went back and forth between them, there are definitely some tonal differences between the two. So the IE600 is a bit richer through the mid-range, it's a slightly fuller sounding IEM overall, whereas the IE900 pulls back a bit in the mid-range and therefore creates a greater sense of space, a little bit more texture and detail in the sound. But ultimately what I found was that I can totally understand some people thinking the IE600 is the better IEM. The IE900 can get a touch more fatiguing, or maybe not fatiguing, but depending on the volume levels you're listening to and the source you're driving it from, the IE900 could be an earphone that you get tired of sooner than the IE600 with its slightly richer, slightly more engaging kind of sound. Having said that, some of that, and probably a lot of that, is going to come down to source. If you're using a richer, warmer source, the IE900 is probably the better IEM. If you've got a cooler, more neutral source, then the IE600 is going to balance that better. And so for me, I think tonality-wise, the IE600 is probably the slightly better IEM from a tonal point of view for most people perhaps. But I think if you're happy to invest a little bit of effort into pairing the IE900 with the right source, and I mean the right source for it, not the right source meaning that there's one good or bad source, but if you're happy to find a good pairing of source and earphone, I think the IE900 does have more to offer. And as a good example, the IE900 paired up with the Questyle M15 dongle is an absolute match made in heaven. It's very, very hard to imagine getting much better sound from a portable IEM-based setup than what you get from the M15 and the IE900s. Whereas with the IE600s, the M15 still sounds great, but it could be getting a little bit too rich and a little bit too warm, and that's where something like a Mojo 2 being a little bit cooler and drier sounding than the M15 is probably better for the IE600s. We're talking very different price points, I know. I'm just using those as examples of the different types of character of source that suit the different IEMs. And so to bring this particular comparison to a close, what I'd say is I think the IE600 is possibly the more enjoyable IEM of these two. But I think if you're looking for the technically superior IEM, the one that can actually go the furthest with the best possible sources, then I do think the IE900 is still deserving of its place at the top of Sennheiser's charts. Just to be really, really clear here, that doesn't mean I'm suggesting it's the best IEM for everybody. And so in that respect, I think it's a question of your preferences and your tastes as to whether the IE600 or the IE900 is the better choice. But then to bring this whole review to a close, what I'd say is that I think both the IE600 and the IE900 are great. And specifically talking about the IE600, this is probably one of the best bang for buck IEMs that I've heard for quite some time. For $700 you're getting an astoundingly good balance of both tonality and an enjoyable tuning, alongside technicalities and capability. Do be prepared for a sound that's not as cold and analytical as some of the trends right now. A lot of the current IEMs coming out, and if we think about the Monarch Mark II as an example, a lot of the IEMs coming out at the moment have a boosted sub-bass, but then a bit of a suck out through the mid-bass into the mids, and then this emphasis in the treble. That's not happening with the IE600, and I love them for that. But do be aware they're a bit of a departure from some of the other tunings that seem to be popular at the moment. And so for me, it's a very easy and very strong recommendation for the IE600 as what I think is one of the best, if not the best IEM at around that $700 mark. Keeping in mind, I haven't heard everything at that range, but from what I have heard so far and from discussions I've had about how other IEMs that I know all compare, I can comfortably say the IE600 is going to be right up there with the very best. Whether it is the best, that's going to be personal preference, but it's a really strong option, and if you're in the market around that $700 mark, do yourself a favour and check out the IE600 if you can. And so as always, I hope you found this review useful and helpful. Hopefully it's made your decision making process easier when it comes to IEMs, particularly around that $700 mark, or whether you should be spending more to upgrade from the IE600. And if you have found the review useful and helpful, I'd love it if you hit the like button, consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.